please summarize your seminar and highlight your main argument?
So I'm going to be talking about my first book, which is titled China's Gambits, The Calculus of Coercion. So mostly I'm going to talk about when, why, and how China uses coercion. And my main argument is that China uses the cost balancing theory to explain a why and a when, and with what tools China is using coercion in the post-Cold War era, highlighting in particular the simultaneous constraining but also enabling effect of global economic interdependence on Chinese foreign and security policies.
In the read-ahead you provided titled Cautious Bully, Reputation Resolved in Beijing's Use of Coercion in the South China Sea, you lay out a cost-balancing theory. What are the main elements being balanced, and how did you determine those metrics?
That's a great question, and the article that you cited here is an article version of the book that I just described. And in the book, I come up with this cost balancing theory to explain China's coercion. And essentially, what that means is that China balances between the need to establish resolve vis-a-vis other states and the economic cost of using coercion. And by the need to use resolve, I mean concerns about appearing weak vis-a-vis other states if no coercive action is taken, because other states might view China as weak and unresolved if it does not use coercive actions against other states. But at the same time, coercion does carry with it costs. And I would argue that the primary cost would be economic. And that's exactly because that China is an economically integrated state and it's part of the global production and supply chains. So it has to take into consideration the potential negative economic consequences of using coercion, especially if militarized coercive tools or including non-militarized coercive tools are chosen. So hence the cost balancing aspect of China using coercion. So that's sort of the first half of the question that I'm asking. And in terms of the second question, which is about the tools of China's coercion, the how question, I would argue that China oftentimes calculates the geopolitical backlash with regard to using military coercion on the target state. So the logic here is that if China believes that if it uses military coercion, then there's a greater risk for a dispute with the target state to escalate into militarized confrontation, especially if the target state has a mutual defense treaty with external great powers. For example, with the United States, then China has to take into consideration such a militarized confrontation. And if China's calculation of such a geopolitical backlash cost is high, then it's more likely to utilize non-militarized coercive tools in lieu of military coercion. And that applies to a lot of the cases that I have analyzed in the book, as well as the article with regard to the South China Sea. So what we end up seeing is a kind of gray zone coercion. So the use of civilian law enforcement tools that are right below the threshold of military coercion, but it still could potentially impose a physical damage on the target state. So that's the theory itself. And in terms of how to measure these three variables, right? Economic cost, need to establish resolve, and geopolitical backlash cost. In the book, I use several kinds of indicators. So the first kind would be primary Chinese language sources, including, for example, internal and publicly available documents from the Chinese government, as well as Chinese government think tanks. So those are think tanks affiliated with the Chinese government. And finally, when it was still easier to conduct interviews in the pre-COVID period, I conducted about 152 interviews for the book with regard to were vis-a-vis former Chinese diplomats, military officials, and analysts from the government think tanks. So in addition to these primary Chinese language sources, I also utilize objective indicators. For example, media reports of the media exposure of some of the incidents that China does not like, with the logic being if we're seeing an increase of such incidents through international media reports, then other states might all be watching and observing these issues, and if China does not take action, then other states might interpreting this inaction as unresolved. So punchline, I use both primary Chinese language sources and objective indicators, including econ stats, to sort of cross-check and triangulate against one another.
And in the case of China, what elements of your theory are most influential in determining when and how to implement coercion?
So I would say all three variables are all very important, and the economic cost of using coercion and the need to establish resolve, these two variables and the balancing of these two variables would be most important for deciding when and why China uses coercion. So China does not use coercion all the time, and it certainly does not target every single country that does similar things that China does not like. So my argument would be these two variables would be critical for deciding when and with whom China would be using coercion. And as for the how question, I would say geopolitical backlash would be the more relevant variable for answering that question, precisely because a militarized confrontation is most likely when the target state has a very tight mutual defense treaty or alliance with external great powers, and if military coercion is used, then it's more likely to invoke such mutual defense treaties, and that's why when the geopolitical backlash cost is higher, it influences the use of coercive tools. So I'm mostly making the distinction between either military coercion or any other kind of non-militarized or non-kinetic kind of coercive tools.
Do you believe your conclusions regarding China's coercive methods, particularly when they decide between employing military and non-military coercive methods, apply to other major powers? And could declining major powers be expected to follow a mirrored calculus of coercion as rising major powers, or would other factors be added into their cost balancing equation?
That's a wonderful question. The first half I have sort of delved into a little bit. The second half, I think someone else should write a book on it, or another book. So in terms of whether the theory can be applicable to other rising powers, I think, or other major powers, I think there are some cases where we can safely say that other powers are behaving in a relatively similar fashion. I would say, if we take Russia, for example, there has been a lot of studies about Russian use of gray zone tactics, and most recently some scholars, including Eric Gartsky, Andreas Gannon, and John Lindsay, would argue that Russia has been using more gray zone tactics since the 1990s, precisely because it's concerned about potential NATO backlash. So in a way, I would say Russia's behavior seems to be very similar to the kind of concerns about geopolitical backlash that we're observing from China. And similarly, if you look at South China Sea cases, the cases that I'm very much interested in, you're actually seeing Vietnam sort of following China's model of using those gray zone kind of tactics. Not necessarily coercion per se, but we do observe Vietnam using more of what they call, I guess, the fishery administrative ships, very much similar to China's Coast Guard ships or the predecessor maritime surveillance ships. Although I would say the Vietnamese counterparts might not be as capable as the current Chinese Coast Guard ships, but we do see a similar kind of behavior with the potential intention being reducing potential escalation with, say, either China or other countries in the region. And as for the second half of the question about declining powers, that I think it's an interesting question. So first off, it's an interesting question to define what is a declining power. Same as the definition of a rising power, I think people will probably disagree on that. But I would say a declining power, just hypothetically, a declining power might behave differently from, say, contemporary rising powers due to several potential scenarios. And here again, this is very much hypothetical. And I would say, for example, you could say that the United States is still a hegemon, but at the same time, its growth, its rate of economic growth and overall capacity growth might not be as high as it used to be. So if you define decline in that way, the United States might be in some sort of decline, at least in terms of growth rate, if not overall capacity, because I think in terms of overall capacity, the United States is not in decline. But in that scenario, I don't think that the theory applies as cleanly to the United States precisely because, well, not so much that it doesn't apply, but more so because the United States probably will have much less economic cost of using coercion, precisely because it controls a lot of the choke points in international political economy. So we call it weaponized interdependence in the study of international political economy. So we might be seeing some hegemonic declining states having less constraint because they might have more of a control in the economic sector, such that the economic cost of using coercion might be much lower than compared to, for example, a rise in power, including China using coercion. And the second potential scenario where I think a declining state might not necessarily match perfectly to the theory is that if we think that a declining state will potentially mean a decline in economic growth or even just overall capacity, that declining state might not necessarily be tapped into the global economy as much as, say, a rise in power is. So here again, that's why I think. So again, I'm not a Russia expert, but at the same time, I think one of the reasons for why Putin decided to invade Ukraine in 2022 might be that the Russian economy is simply not as intertwined in the global economy, the same level or size that the Chinese economy is. It certainly has a lot of energy sector that's intertwined, but at the same time, it does not have, say, nearly as much as of the intricate production and supply chains that a Chinese economy has. So either a declining state is still really powerful economically, or it might not be tapped too much into the global economy. So that's why, hypothetically, I think a declining state might behave differently than compared to, say, contemporary rising powers, including China.
Could you offer a sneak peek into your next book project? What questions are you seeking to answer, and do you have any theories yet?
Right. Oh, perfect. Great question. So I do have a title, and I do have a question, and I have a hypothesis. So the title of the second book is tentatively Economic Interdependence and Rise in Power Grand Strategy. So I'm essentially interested in understanding to what extent and in what ways would economic interdependence affect the grand strategy of rising powers, including both contemporary rising powers such as China and also historical rising powers. So say Bismarck in Germany, or interwar Japan, or early American Republic. The central hypothesis that I have about the book is that economic interdependence is a structure very much like polarity is a structure that changes over time, and contemporary economic interdependence in the form of global production and supply chains is different from historical economic interdependence. Right? Historical economic interdependence tends to be more like me trading apples for your oranges, that kind of production-based interdependence. But contemporary economic interdependence is down to the production and supply chain level. What that means is that no country can produce a finished product without the gazillion intermediate products from other states that they import in order to produce that final product. And because of this intricate interconnectedness that we're observing today, I'm arguing that it has a simultaneous constraining but also enabling effect on a contemporary Chinese grand strategy, making it different from historical rising powers in two ways. So first off, it tends to be more cautious about the use of force, including using negative forms of statecraft, such as coercion or economic sanctions, because it is concerned about instability to the global production and supply chains, which will have in turn a negative impact on its economy. But at the same time, because China is part of this global production and supply chains, it also has leverage over certain countries. In particular, I would argue smaller and weaker countries, say for example the Philippines or other medium-sized countries in the world. So what that means is that China does not necessarily have to escalate to the military use of force in order to get what they want, right? They can use economic sanctions or even just a simple ban on certain products, not not even an embargo, in order to get what they want. So what that leads to would be a grand strategy that is assertive, but at the same time is oftentimes below the threshold of military use of force. You can sort of say that's the gray zone of rise in power grand strategies in the contemporary era.